So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to tell you all about our development and use of sooting tendencies to develop sustainable fuels with optimized properties. The paper that's associated with this is authored by the Yale group, a group at Colorado State, and a group at Penn State. These are the authors. The one in the middle is Charles McAnally, who is sort of the father of our YSI approach. And Zhanhang Jie is our graduate student. So currently, the world's energy economy follows a linear model. In other words, fuels are burned into CO2 and water. And this has dramatically improved quality of life, but it also causes lots of problems, including climate change, health, and geopolitical problems about energy distribution. The group here, all of us, are involved in creating a circular energy economy with sustainable fuels. Here, hydrocarbons are still burned for energy, but they are made by recycling CO2. So there's two main types here. Biofuels that are made by plants using photosynthesis from CO2, and synthetic fuels that are made catalytically, hopefully using green power and using waste CO2. Our group is also involved in this synthetic fuel development. We've demonstrated catalytic conversion of CO2 directly to ethane, and hopefully in the future to ethylene. But the question remains is if we can synthesize many different compounds, which composition should the sustainable fuel have? So that's the focus of this talk, of how we can understand choosing these fuels. So as we said, soot emissions cause climate change. This is a figure from Voigt et al., where they've looked at ice particle number per kilogram of fuel versus soot particle number per kilogram of fuel. Now, why is this important? Well, soot directly heats the atmosphere by absorbing light. It increases the Earth's absorption of energy when it's deposited on snow and ice. And relevant to this slide, it nucleates water vapor into contrails and clouds that trap IR radiation. And in terms of aviation fuels, this contrail effect is the largest contribution of aviation to climate change. Soot emissions also cause human health issues. So the World Health Organization, WHO, has a guideline of 5 microgram per meter cubed of PM 2.5 concentration in the atmosphere. But the problem is that nearly everyone, over 90% of the world's population, as shown in this graph, live in areas with much higher concentrations of PM 2.5. And this is from Hammer Environmental Science and Technology, the graph. And that they've estimated that this exposure causes millions of deaths every year. So it's not a minor problem. Therefore, these are the reasons that sooting tendency is a key target for optimization of these fuels. Sooting tendency depends very strongly on molecular structure. For example, in the photo here, with the same amount of fuel, the benzene pool fire is much more sooty than the similar sized ethanol pool fire. And we found over time that even very small changes in fuel composition can strongly affect soot emissions. And the important question is, why does sooting tendency depend so strongly on fuel structure? The answer to this is that the fuel decomposes into a pool of primary hydrocarbon products in the flame, and these can either be quickly oxidized or grow to higher hydrocarbons and soot. And the sooting tendency is determined by the identity of the primary particles and how they can grow to larger aromatics and soot. And this is really important for a number of reasons. One, in choosing the structures, and two, that the sooting tendencies that we have measured for a wide range of fuels can be used to show where decomposition pathways could be different than we originally thought. And so this is just a very simple example showing that ethanol can decompose into some oxygenates and small hydrocarbons. And in order to form soot, those small hydrocarbons have to form the first benzene ring or aromatic ring. Whereas benzene can go directly through phenyl radical to higher aromatics and eventually soot. In order to develop property structure correlations, we need large sooting tendency data sets to be able to answer the question of what composition should sustainable fuels have. So because we have to develop structure property relationships that can accurately predict the properties of proposed fuels. And developing these relationships requires a large data set. So there's many techniques for measuring sooting propensity, smoke point and others. The smoke point is important because it's in some regulations, but all of these techniques have very limited data sets. So it's not included in this presentation, but we discussed its details in the paper, accompanying paper. Our technique, yield sooting index, is a new technique that allows large data sets. For example, there's currently over 650 species in the database, and that's the focus of this presentation. So first, we need to define what yield sooting index is. So we take a methane flame and we dope 1,000 parts per million of the test fuels. And so for this, we're using heptane and toluene as our endpoints and as calibration standards. So we measure the soot concentration in each of the flames along the center line and other ways also. And then this YSI is calculated with this weighted average. The YSI of toluene is 170.9, and the YSI of heptane is 36. And details are shown in our previous 2019 symposium paper. And a really important point is that YSI measures fuels at the same conditions, the same flame conditions. So a paper by Glassman and al. Gave the figure on the right to show that sooting tendency depends strongly on flame temperature. And sooting tendency also depends on fuel malefaction as presented in a paper by Law et al. So the YSI methodology allows comparisons based on composition and structure separate from varying flame conditions such as temperature, fuel-air mixture, and intermediate combustion products, etc. Another wonderful aspect is that we only require a very small sample to do each measurement, so that the required sample volume is less than 100 microliters per test. And the picture at the bottom right shows the samples and how small they are compared with a pen. This allows compounds to be tested that are custom synthesized and are difficult to synthesize in large quantities. And the examples of things we've measured are branched alkanes with large side chains. Another really important feature is that YSI has a large dynamic range. So we're able to measure things that have very low sooting tendencies. In other words, 6.6 and 0.5 for these dimethyl oxymethanes, for example, and have very, very high sooting tendencies, like these multiple ring aromatics that have sooting tendencies from 1250 to 1340. And so that's an extremely important property of the measurement technique. YSI can also be measured for solids where the solids are dissolved in ethanol, and then the endpoint compounds have to be measured with ethanol at the same concentration. These solids are not necessarily viable for fuel molecules, but they're useful because they expand the training set for our structure property relationships. They can also reveal interesting behavior, such as the very low sooting tendency of phenols, as you see below. The trial, benzene trial, has extremely low sooting tendencies. Also, the YSI flames can be detail simulated. Why is this? Well, they have better boundary conditions than wick burners, and the procedure involves only one methane flame with fixed fuel rate, flow rates. The base methane flame can be simulated in detail, and with the dopants, you only need to treat it as a perturbation. So it makes the gridding procedure extremely easy. And this is important because in the longer term, simulations can be used to validate kinetic measurements and examine parameters that are hard to study experimentally, such as pressure. And the figure to the right is from the Quan paper in Fuel, showing that we're able to calculate the yield sooting index for pressures from 1 atmosphere to 15 atmospheres, and show how the YSI depends on pressure. Other groups have measured YSI, principally the Legros group. And why this is interesting is that depending on how they do the measurement, either looking at the global maximum of fuel volume fraction, the maximum intensity, and across the flame, not just on the center line, and our measured YSI on the black dots. And what's useful is that they're all the same, and so that they agree between different research groups, and how the soot is measured, either on this evaluated at the center line or for the entire flame. And this paper is by Kashif et al. On combustion flame. So this is an example of how we use the YSI and other structure property relationships to optimize fuel structure. And this is polyoxane methylene ethers, which are potential sustainable diesel fuels. And the picture is on the right, where the R's are methyl groups. It has extremely low sooting tendency, but poor heat of combustion and undesirable water solubility. Water solubility is an important feature that needs to be minimized to prevent contamination of the environment. These polyoxymethylene ethers with larger N groups have better heats of combustion, are water insoluble, but they have higher sooting tendency. So how do we find what the optimal fuel structure is? So this is an example, and to examine the trade-offs, we have designed a landscape of potential POMEs and use structure property relationships to predict key fuel properties. And the POMA giving the best is the butyl substituted one. as shown in the figure here, table here from, and the criteria properties were by Ken Reardon. And the reds are things that are good, that exceed the criteria, and the blue are the bad that don't meet the criteria. And so we see that the butyl one exceeds the criteria. And what are the criteria? The lower heating value, the YSI, boiling point, melting point, flash point, derived, cetane number, and water solubility. So we have to look at all of these that are predicted using structure property relationships. We have an online YSI database available from the Harvard Dataverse, and here is the link. The current version contains YSIs for 447 compounds. An updated version is being released with this presentation that contains measured YSIs for over 650 compounds. And this is freely, without cost, available. Another important point is that YSI and smoke point agree reasonably well. And that's important because smoke point is involved in some design criteria. And so the plot on the right is YSI divided by the moles of oxidizer required to burn 1 mole of fuel. SP is a smoke point. And the correlation indicates that sooting tendency is a true fuel property. A derived smoke point can be calculated from this data and is useful, again, because smoke point is used as a design criteria. And if you look at the plot on the right-hand side here, you notice that some things, it mostly agrees. Some things don't. You'd expect aromatics not to agree very well because they have such short smoke points that the error is large. So this is a consistent argument that shows that YSI and the derived smoke point can be used for design criteria. If you just look at atomic composition, you don't get a good correlation at all. The C to H ratio is somewhat correlative, but certain compounds that have the same C to H ratio have YSIs varying by a factor of 10. So this is not a useful correlation. Heteroatoms like oxygen and nitrogen tend to reduce YSI, but there's significant overlap between pure hydrocarbons and heteroatom. One thing that's interesting is the stereoisomerism does not seem to affect sooting tendency. The YSIs of enantiomers are identical to within uncertainty. And YSIs and smoke points of many geometric isomers are also identical. So this is very useful to simplify structure property relationships. Also, the YSI database reveals detailed structural trends. So here we have measured YSI versus the number of carbons for branched alkanes. And we have data here for 0 branches, 1 branch, 2 branches, and 3 branches. And the details, what's interesting is the details of the branches are not important, including the size of the branches and their position along the main carbon chain. So the other very important thing in this day and age is that YSI enables machine learning. 650 is still small for a machine learning criterion, but it has allowed reasonably accurate predictions of YSI. So many structure property relationships have been developed for YSI. We have our combined groups have two models, a group contribution method with plus linear regression, from a combustion flame paper, and a different molecular descriptor model that has a sort of linear neural network model in energy and fuels. There are many, many other groups who have used machine learning models with our databases. Below is 3 different ones selected just because they use different ways of computing. So machine learning techniques vary widely according to descriptors and the statistical models used. And available freely is the YSI estimator from our data and done by NREL, primarily Peter St. John developed the statistical model. So it retrains the group contribution coefficients each time it's run, and the training set is regularly updated with our now 650 species. This is a nearest neighbor model. So it looks just at the number of different functional groups in each molecule. And machine learning, even in this very simple nearest neighbor form, can reveal very interesting kinetic behavior. For example, in this graph to the left, gives measured YSI on the x-axis and predicted YSI on the y-axis. And if we look at 2 different isomers, myrcene and beta ocimene, they have very, very different YSIs, even though the structure is not so different. But once you see this, you realize that beta ocimene needs a not nearest neighbor mechanism. And that's easily shown by this H-atom abstraction versus direct form that can be directly cyclicized to aromatics, whereas the myrcene, the weakest bond is here, and you get 2 smaller molecules that have to go through addition reactions in order to form aromatics. So what are some of our future directions? For measurements, we want to measure more compounds with heteroatoms, like nitrogen, chlorine, sulfur, for example. Why is this interesting? Well, from Matthew Montgomery's thesis and this combustion flame article, we see that the sooting propensity of the nitrogen substituted compounds are lower for every one of these that was tested. And that's important as you get lower YSI, but you have higher heat of combustion, so that they can be better than the oxygenated forms. We also would like to measure cycloalkanes. Multiple cyclic compounds with strained rings are now being studied as high energy density fuels. For simulations, we can, because as we said earlier, you can do pretty easily detailed calculations of the entire flame. And here we can study fuel properties such as mass diffusivity, but also the effect of flame parameters such as pressure, which was shown earlier in an earlier slide. Also, there are many different applications of machine learning. In this example on the right, we start out with this linear compound, and we're trying to optimize the Ron parameter. The x-axis is the number of iterations, so the structure is perturbed and perturbed and perturbed. And finally, it gets to this strained ring compound. So you can develop empirical structure property relationships for similar molecular families and relate them to first principles kinetic modeling. And you can use generative AI to create new molecules that have low sooting tendency combined with other desirable compounds. So we'd like to acknowledge the funders for the Yale side. There's the U.S. Department of Energy Vehicle Technology Office and the Bioenergy Office, Technologies Office, U.S. National Science Foundation, and NREL, our NREL collaborators. We also thank the many researchers, and the list is huge, who have provided us with fuel samples. Thank you.